Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three different topics. The first one is going to be the execution of Armenian POWs by the armed forces of the Aliyev regime. The second one is going to be the continued controversy or talk about Armenia's membership in CSTO and if it should continue or not. And the last one is going to be about what's going on to the south of us in the Iranian political uprisings of the last few weeks. Let's start off with the execution of our POWs. There's these videos that were released this week that show 7 of our POWs in one post that was attacked and conquered by the forces of the Aliyev regime in Armenia proper territory, in which immediately after that, 7 of our POWs were executed ISIS style. This video was apparently released by some agents of either the Azeri regime or other people involved in Azerbaijan. And it's almost like they were proud of their act, because normally even criminal states, when they do war crimes, they don't advertise it. So obviously there's secondary intent with this. Regardless of who of these degenerate gunmen was who committed this war crime, and obviously they should be investigated and they should be prosecuted. There's actually one person who's primarily, singularly responsible for this, and he's the gangster in Baku, Ilhan Aliyev. Because what happened at that day and that morning is the only logical conclusion of a campaign of ethnic hatred, bigotry, and aggression that he has been pursuing for all of his years in power. So despite the fact that all of these people who committed this war crime should be investigated and prosecuted, the actual person that should be investigated and prosecuted sits in his palace in Baku. And until we deal with that, we're dealing with falsehoods. Now let's move on to the enablers of this war crime and all the other war crimes that have been carried out by the Aliyev regime against Armenian POWs and civilians. Who's responsible for this? Who actually enabled it? We know who's responsible. The first enabler is a gentleman named Toivu Klar. He's actually the EU representative to this region. Let's give an example of how he has actually enabled this kind of behavior and made it acceptable. Let's go over a series of tweets that he did this week. After this executions happened, he put up a very weak tweet in which he said the execution of Armenian POWs must be investigated, without naming who executed them, which country they're from, and which leader they were taking orders from. Then this was followed up by him being attacked by some front press organizations that are owned by the regime in Baku, essentially attacking him, saying he's not being neutral and all of that. And he immediately followed that with a tweet that was entirely based on lies and falsehoods. He put out this tweet saying, I've received videos of similar crimes being committed by Armenian soldiers, which is straight out slander. There was no such videos and there was no such actions. So obviously what he's trying to do here is to create this false, degenerate moral equivalency that doesn't exist. And from this point on, frankly, we need to be honest about this man. He should not be called the EU special representative in this region. He should be called what he is, which is Ilhan Aliyev's lawyer, nothing more and nothing less. Let's move on to find out, or actually discuss, who is Toivu Klar and where he comes from. You know, I've been involved in political life for more than 30 years, and frankly, political systems all over the world are full of the Toivu Klars of the world. I've met them many times. They are apparatchiks and functionaries, faceless, soulless people who, for the most part, will do their tasks and get their pensions and move on, no matter what it is that they do in their lifetimes. They're exactly the type of people who in good times can be tasked with, building parks, building schools, and they will do so competently. And in wrong times, if they're asked to run the trains to Auschwitz properly, they will make sure that happens. Or to make sure that Talat Pasha's caravans to the desert are working properly, they will do the same. So there's essentially 2 ways to deal with such functionaries. 1, you buy them, and 2, you scare them. Obviously, our government is not in the business of buying people, as the Baku regime is. So what I would say is you need to treat this man like dirt. You need to attack him. You need to humiliate him. You need to threaten to ban him from the country. You need to ask for his firing. And by constantly putting pressure on him and attacking him, then he will behave properly. Until you do so, he will continue to act for what he really is, which is Ilhan Aliyev's personal lawyer and representative to Armenia. Let's move on to the second person I have on my list, which is Ursula von der Leyen, European Council President. Ms. van der Leyen, that execution has your fingerprints on it. What did you think was going to happen after you made that silly trip of yours to Baku? What did you expect a regime like that to take your confirmation of their behavior? What they took your trip as you're approving their aggression, their genocidal talk, and their actions against the people of Artsakh and Armenia. The execution is on you as much as it is on your representative to this region. Thirdly, is every politician, journalist, think tank person over the years that took trips to Baku to legitimize that government. Fourth is all the press flacks, the PR people who have spent years lying about the Azeri regime and its purposes and its intent against its people and against the people of Artsakh and Armenia. Let's move on to our government, specifically our foreign ministry and our foreign minister, Aref Mirzoyan. The same day that this video came out, he was going to have a meeting with Aliyev's foreign minister in Europe. And my question for him is, why did you not walk out of that meeting? Why did you not throw a fit? Why didn't you not ask for a delay of this meeting and press the EU, press other countries to investigate this, not the silly investigation that supposedly Aliyev is going to do? If you're not going to put a price on Armenian life, no one will. It is your responsibility to, through the biggest fit imaginable, to walk out of there, to say, I'll be back in a week, tell me how you're investigating this, demand the firing of Toivu, or put him on the spot, attack him, bend him on our side. You did none of those things. That is what we were expecting from you that day. Let's move on to our second topic of the week, which is the issue of CSTO, or actually Armenia's continued membership in CSTO. After the latest Aliyev's aggressions and attack on proper Armenian territory, there were obviously great disappointment in the inaction of CSTO, or even saying anything that was worthwhile. And there's actually been a lot of calls, public demonstrations demanding for Armenia to leave CSTO, as saying that it is a worthless organization and that it actually hinders us to have defense relationships with the West. Let's look at this issue. And before we get there, I want to look at a couple of statements that were made by different high Russian officials in regards to things in the South Caucasus, and then we'll move on to the specifics about how we should act or what are the best ways to approach the CSTO situation. In a lengthy interview, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexei Overchuk, did one thing which was interesting, which was effectively rule out any sovereign road between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan, and he did so very clearly. And why is this important? Because by him doing that, it essentially isolates the Aliyev regime, because they're the only ones who are demanding that. They're the only ones in the process of negotiations who are demanding that. The US, the EU, and Russia all oppose a sovereign road, and he said that countries should control their own sovereign roads and whatever traffic that goes through it. In fact, he specifically said the sovereignty over the road will be exercised by a country whose territory the road passes, which is actually a good thing. Then we move on to comments that were made by Sergei Krupkin, which is the Russian ambassador to Armenia, on a visit to the regions of Armenia that were heavily attacked by the Aliyev regime. He demanded the withdrawal of troops to the initial positions as the only way of solving this problem. Now, what's interesting here is he does not denote who actually invaded who, which is rather interesting for an ally. There's no going back to the position. There's only one party that attacked, and it's the Aliyev regime, and he's obviously not willing to call him on it. And there's obviously, at this point, contrasts clearly with the US position and the UK position and the France position. and actually isn't very much, it's only one step above the EU position, which is not where you want to be. The US, France, and UK have clearly called out the aggressor and asked for them to withdraw. The EU has not, and in this case, Russia just says go back to initial positions without calling out who is attacking who. So what should our position with CSTO be? A few things. The first thing is that we need to understand that as a practical matter, CSTO does not exist. And we need to act accordingly. And what I mean by that is deal with any country, west, east, wherever, that can help us defend ourselves, sell us weapons, and upgrade our ability to defend ourselves. We should ignore it like it's some furniture in the room and not much more than that. With our Western friends, we need to make the case. We need to make this precise case that do not hold us to leaving CSTO, because frankly, at this point, it would be an unnecessary poke at already a cornered Russia, which is not something that is needed. It's not something we need at this point. It's much better to ignore the entity and move on. And they just need to understand that Armenia's membership in CSTO is just about as relevant as Armenia being part of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. It has no practical effect. This should obviously be our first course of action, but if the West puts in any relationship on a military matter or sales matter on CSTO, then that's a secondary issue that we need to consider about if it's ever worth moving out of CSTO or not. Hopefully they will not put us in that position. Let's move on to the third topic of the week, which is the, for lack of a better phrase, the Iranian political uprising. These demonstrations and political actions started about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, after the murder of an Iranian Kurdish woman named Mahsa Amini, who is suspected to have been murdered by the morality police. Now, for those who don't know what morality police is, these are people who go around in vans in Iran, in different parts of the country, and they enforce hijab rules, dress codes. Essentially, they're religious police to force you to follow religious laws, whether you want them or not. And there's been a tug of war between civil society pushing back on this morality police for a long time, has led to massive demonstrations across the country. Obviously, these demonstrations are not just about this issue. They're about the economic problems in the country, the political repression, and all these other things. And they've essentially morphed from unhappiness with the morality police to somewhat of a revolutionary movement. There's a lot of unique things with this. In fact, it's the first, political uprising, or if you want to call it revolutionary uprising, that's led on feminist issues and by women mostly, and in some cases, girls as young as 14. It is very hard not to be sympathetic to women fighting for their basic human rights, no matter what the political implications are. But looking at what this means in general for this region, for Armenia. Obviously, our state is not going to react to this because our state's options are limited, and a relationship with Iran because of trade routes and other things are quite important. Obviously, there hasn't been a state reaction. I don't expect one. However, that does not mean that as a civil society in Armenia, we're not very clear about which side we're on. Our country is an island of freedom in a sea of tyranny, and we have to morally stand by the people of Iran, especially the women who are fighting for their basic human rights. Going back, actually, there's actually, if we call it a freedom struggle, Armenians in Iran have always been part and parcel of the freedom struggle in Iran. In fact, the Iranian constitutional system was enforced by 3 Khans more than 100 years ago that led an uprising, one of them being Armenian, Yeprem Khan, coincidentally working with 2 other Azeri Khans that essentially established the constitutional system in Iran. Now, let's look at what the direct impacts of change or not change for Armenia of all these Iranian uprisings mean. There's 2 variables here. Do I think this is likely to lead to a revolution at this point? I do not, because I think unless these student demonstrations are met by the greater parts of the society, which I think is very clear is supporting the protesters, but is not joining them in large numbers, most likely this will not lead to revolutionary change. However, as we know, in such situations, things can change immediately. One shooting of 50 protesters, one thing on video someplace, and you can trigger a much broader, much larger uprising. So this has not played itself out. If the current revolutionary movement actually leads to overthrowing of the current government, the likely outcome is that the government that will take its place eventually is bound to be far more pro-Western and far more pro-democratic, which in the long run is actually something that's very good for Armenia because it enables us to deal with Iran without any of the pressures that come from the West in not dealing with them. And in fact, in many ways, such a country and such a political system can become actually our closest regional allies in more ways than one. However, at the same time, there's the big risk that any kind of a long political crisis, an uprising that goes on for months in the country that starts debilitating things like transportation systems, underlying the geopolitical force, the lineups in this region are actually quite risky for Armenia. But obviously, these are all out of our control. So there's a possibility of long-term better prospects in a new governmental system in Iran. However, there are extreme short-term risks. And you can also see this in other relationships. Specifically, any kind of a change in the Iranian political system will make the Israeli-Azeri relationship far less relevant and will actually downgrade it by multiples. And lastly, as we know, revolutionary change like this, especially in the Muslim world, actually has a domino effect. And we saw this during Arab Spring. It is not out of the realm of possibilities that in a revolutionary Iran, the fallout from it will start trickling into Central Asia or even countries like Al-Ayas, which actually culturally has more affinity with Iran than any other country in the world. So these are effects that are going to be in question right now, but they could be monumental for many years to come. In conclusion, there's a lot that we don't know about this particular situation. However, I think the one thing that we can be somewhat certain of is that if this isn't the end of the current Iranian political system, it's likely the beginning of the end. And for one simple reason, because this is an uprising led by young people in a country in which young people are vastly overrepresented. And what it seems to the world is that the young people in Iran have actually lost their fear. They've lost their fear against tremendous repression, killing, torture, half a dozen different things, which are horrible. And when you have a situation like that, the regime could actually quite successfully suppress these protests, and it could suppress protests the next time that they come up. But it's only a matter of time, whether that's 6 months, 5 years, or 10 years, that the current political system either vastly reforms itself, or it's going to be replaced by something that is far more democratic and likely to be far more pro-Western. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
که این گندم تو خیابونه خوشه خشم من و تو تشنه